They found him hunched over in his withered cornfield, skin weathered like old leather, eyes distant as the horizon he stared at daily. His faded overalls hung loose on his gaunt frame, and his calloused hands trembled slightly as they clutched. A handful of parched soil that crumbled between his fingers. The Cherokee healer who discovered him almost passed by, but the sound of labored breathing drew her attention to the dilapidated farmhouse most travelers avoided. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nestled between rolling hills and forgotten promises, Edgar Mercer rocked slowly in his porch chair, clutching a small wooden music box to his chest. His eyes, once bright with determination, now reflected only resignation and solitude. The local doctor said he hadn't spoken a proper sentence to anyone for nearly 3 years, that he flinched whenever strangers approached his property, and that the small leather-bound almanac he kept in his pocket contained pages filled with careful tallies, marking days until some unspoken deadline. No one could agree exactly what happened at Willow Creek Farm, but the remains of the once thriving homestead told enough of the story-neglected fields, a slowly collapsing barn, personal belongings gathering dust, and faded photographs turned face down on every surface. Edgar himself was like those photographs, a man who had deliberately turned away from his own history. Pinewood Crossing wasn't on any official map, just a cluster of buildings that grew where a railroad spur met the old cattle trail. The town sat in the shadow of gentle hills, a place where most travelers simply passed through, never lingering longer than necessary. Dust collected on windowsills, and most buildings leaned slightly, as if perpetually bracing against the next storm. Nothing about Pinewood Crossing invited permanence, not the unpaved main street that turned to mud with every rain, not the general store with its limited inventory, and certainly not the wary glances that followed strangers. Edgar Mercer walked these streets like a phantom, always at odd hours when few people were about. Most mornings he moved through town before the bakery fired up its ovens, before the post office sorted the day's mail, before anyone had cause to look his way twice. The townspeople called him Old Man Mercer when they thought he couldn't hear. Some called him Dying Edgar behind closed doors. A few of the kinder souls simply referred to him as that poor Johnson boy, though he hadn't been a boy for nearly 5 decades and hadn't carried the Johnson name since his mother remarried after his father's death. Edgar never corrected them. What did names matter anymore? His farmhouse stood at the far edge of the county where the northern road began its climb toward the distant mountains. No one called on him there, not the traveling preacher, not the doctor unless absolutely necessary, not even the women who brought food to the sick and bereaved. His gate stayed closed, a single lantern burning low in the window each night. Those who passed by might glimpse his silhouette standing motionless at the window, watching the road like someone expecting visitors who would never arrive. The general store kept a small crate of supplies for him near the back door. He never entered the main shop, never lingered to exchange pleasantries. He'd leave a list with exact payments wrapped in a handkerchief, take what Mrs. Granger prepared for him, and vanish before anyone noticed. In his absence, rumors swelled to fill the void he left behind. His family was killed in a house fire. Some said, no, it was disease that took his wife and children, others insisted. I heard he went mad after losing the family farm in Kansas and doesn't remember his real name at all. The truth was, Edgar had tried to speak about his past once, after Naomi Wildflower, the Cherokee healer, brought him back from the brink of death during a particularly harsh winter. But the sound of his own voice had unleashed something inside him, a torrent he couldn't control. After that, silence became his sanctuary, solid and dependable when nothing else was. The townspeople didn't know that his right hand still ached from digging a row of graves years ago. They didn't know that he couldn't bear the sound of children's laughter, or that he still woke screaming some nights, though no sound escaped his lips. They didn't know he kept a collection of small, worn shoes hidden in a trunk in his attic, unable to part with them but equally unable to look at them daily. No one asked, and Edgar had stopped hoping anyone would. 10 years earlier, he had established Willow Creek Farm with bright hopes, his new bride beside him, his father's watch in his pocket, and a deed to the most fertile soil in the county. Josephine had called him her steadfast oak, said he was strong and unbending, providing shelter for their future. He promised her a home filled with children's laughter, a prosperous farm to sustain generations. The railroad speculation didn't interest him. Rich soil was treasure enough. But promises crumble easily under Midwestern skies. After the tragedy at Willow Creek, after the sickness and the desperate prayers that went unanswered, after he'd stood motionless before a row of small markers, Edgar had emerged alone. No family to nurture, no future to plan, just ashes and the cruel indifference of fields that still needed tending despite his grief. He'd stayed in Pinewood Crossing because he had nowhere else to go, because the land where everything ended became the only place that made sense. The townsfolk had made space for his existence but never truly made him welcome. Edgar sometimes paused outside the schoolhouse, listening to children recite their lessons through the open windows. Once, a little girl with braided hair spotted him and waved. Edgar had managed a slight nod in return. The next day, the teacher closed the windows when he passed by. Only the wild things seemed to accept his presence without judgment. A red fox often lingered at the edge of his vegetable garden. Barn owls nested in his rafters year after year. The silence they shared required no explanations, no painful memories examined in daylight. He earned his meager living with his hands, growing enough to sustain himself and occasionally selling surplus at market. Quiet work for a quiet existence. But his eyes, once described by Josephine as warm as fresh-turned earth, now carried the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some days the town seemed to forget he existed at all. Other days, a wayward glance or hushed conversation reminded him that he remained an outsider, a living reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. He didn't defend himself from their whispers. Who chooses to live alone like that? What kind of man turns away from the church, from community? Something's not right about a man who prefers the company of empty rooms. Edgar had asked himself these questions too many times to count. The version of himself that had established Willow Creek Farm, the man who'd sung ballads while he worked, who'd written cheerful letters to distant relatives, who'd carved small wooden animals for children not yet conceived, that Edgar had died alongside everyone he loved. What remained was something quieter, watchful, forever listening for sounds that haunted his dreams. Then one morning in early autumn, he discovered footprints outside his farmhouse door. Not the heavy boots of townsmen, not his own familiar steps. These were different, smaller, numerous, purposeful, almost entirely erased by the night's gentle rain, but unmistakably there, leading toward the dilapidated barn that bordered his small garden plot. Edgar stood motionless, clutching his suspenders. With trembling hands, heart thundering against his ribs, he didn't follow the tracks, not yet. Instead, he turned and whispered to the empty kitchen behind him, the first words he'd spoken aloud in nearly 3 years. Someone's coming. It was a Wednesday when everything changed, though in Pinewood Crossing, most days bled into one another, without distinction. The air felt different somehow, charged with something Edgar couldn't name but recognized in his bones. He spent the morning repairing a broken fence post, his back aching from the effort, tools scattered around him. When he straightened and turned toward the house, he saw her standing at his gate. She wasn't from town, her city clothes, and the way she stood told him that much. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing a face marked by determination and fatigue. A small leather satchel hung at her side, and she clutched a folder of papers in her gloved hands. Edgar froze halfway between the fence and his porch, his hammer still clutched in his hand like a shield. For several long moments, neither of them moved or spoke. The only sounds were autumn leaves rustling and a distant crow's call overhead. "Mr. Mercer," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "My name is Elizabeth Hargrove. I've come about the children." Her name was Elizabeth Hargrove, and she stood at his gate like a woman accustomed to facing closed doors. Edgar hadn't moved, his hammer still gripped tightly, suspicion, and something like fear keeping him rooted in place. "I mean no harm," she said, keeping her distance. "I've been searching for weeks." The mention of children had stirred something in Edgar that he'd long tried to bury. Children. His mind flashed to small shoes, to laughter silenced, to tiny graves in a neat row. He took one step back then. Another. Whatever news this woman carried, he wasn't ready. 10 years had passed since Willow Creek became a graveyard of dreams, and still, the memories felt raw as open wounds. He turned and fled to his house, shutting the door firmly behind him. Through the window, he watched her. She didn't follow, didn't call after him. She simply nodded as if she'd expected this response, then settled onto a fallen log near his gate. She opened her satchel, removed a notebook and pencil, and began to write, as comfortable waiting as she seemed in everything else. Edgar pressed his back against the door, heart racing. Children. The word echoed in his mind like stones dropped in still water. What children could there be after all this time? His children were gone, taken by the fever that had swept through the region a decade ago, claiming his wife and their 4 little ones in a single merciless week. He slid down to sit on the floor, drawing his knees to his chest. The day faded to dusk as he sat there, memories washing over him in waves he couldn't control. The town of Pinewood Crossing had its own rhythm, separate from Edgar's silent world. Mayor Thompson counted 15 buildings worthy of the name, though half of them needed fresh paint after each winter. The Silver Dollar Saloon marked the southern edge, its piano slightly out of tune, but played with enthusiasm every Saturday night. The general store stocked everything from nails to sugar to simple medicines, though anything fancier required a journey to Springfield, 2 days' ride to the east. The town had grown haphazardly where the railroad spur met the cattle trail, a water tower and natural spring having made it a logical stopping point. Over time, buildings sprouted like determined weeds. Most settlers moved on after a season or two. Those who stayed were either running from something or had nowhere else to run to. Sheriff Davis kept order with more common sense than law, his office doubling as the town jail with its 2 cells rarely occupied. The schoolhouse had 11 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, taught by Miss Cambridge, a spinster from Cincinnati who still wore high-neck dresses despite the prairie heat. People in Pinewood Crossing lived with constant awareness of nature's indifference. Homes were built close together despite the open land available. Doors were barred during storms. Children were called inside before sunset. The frontier demanded vigilance, and those who survived learned to heed its warnings. Edgar existed at the edges of this cautious community. His farmhouse sat where the northern road began to climb toward the distant mountains, far enough from town to feel separate, close enough that smoke from his chimney could still be seen on clear days. The land had been given to him out of pity after his family died. The town had collectively purchased it from the railroad company when the original settlement plan failed. Edgar remembered little of those first weeks after the funerals. The pastor's wife had tended to him, speaking in soothing tones that barely registered. The mayor had asked questions he couldn't answer. The preacher had prayed over him, though he'd stopped believing in a merciful God, somewhere between the first child's fever and the last small grave he dug with bleeding hands. Eventually, the farmhouse had been offered a railroad company manager's abandoned dwelling, reinforced and made weathertight by the townsmen. Edgar accepted it with a nod, the only communication he could manage. In time, he made it his own, a small garden behind it, a porch that caught the afternoon light, a rocking chair where he sometimes sat watching the sunset. The silence he wore wasn't exactly a choice. Words had simply failed him after what he'd witnessed. Or perhaps he had failed them, inadequate vessels for the horror he carried. Either way, the quiet became his companion, more reliable than any person could be. The town developed its own stories about him, some believing he'd lost his mind. Along with his family, others whispering that he was touched by spirits, that he communed with the dead at night. A few claimed he had brought the fever upon his family through some unknown sin. Most simply felt uncomfortable in his presence. His silence a mirror reflecting their own fears of what fate might take from them too. Edgar was aware of the whispers. How could he not be? They trailed behind him on his rare ventures into town, hung in the air when he approached the general store. He didn't blame them. Fear needed somewhere to land, and he was an easy target. The strange, silent man who had survived when his family hadn't. He kept to his routines, rising before dawn, tending his garden, repairing endless small breaks in the aging farmhouse, simple tasks that required no speech, that filled the hours. With movement instead of memory. At night, he counted stars through his window, not words but numbers, anything that anchored him to the present moment, rather than pulling him back to those fevered days. Only in sleep did his discipline falter. Dreams came, vivid and merciless small. Hands reaching for him, his wife's final whispered plea to save the children, the hollow feeling as he realized he could save none of them. He would wake gasping, sheets twisted around his limbs like restraints. On those nights, he would sit on the porch until dawn, watching the road, clutching the small wooden music box that had been his daughter's favorite possession. 10 years had passed this way, summer to fall, to winter to spring, and back to summer again. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his presence, if not comfortable with it. They left him alone, and he left them to their lives. It was an unspoken arrangement. That served everyone well enough. Until today. Until Elizabeth Hargrove arrived with news of children, shattering the fragile peace he had constructed. As darkness fell, Edgar lit a single candle and placed it in the window, his nightly ritual. He watched through the glass as Elizabeth looked. Up from her writing, her face illuminated briefly by the flame. Their eyes met across the distance. She nodded once, then returned to her work, showing no signs of leaving. He knew he should feel frightened by her presence, a stranger connected to his past camping at the edge of his property. Yet fear wasn't what stirred in his chest as he watched her. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in so long. He almost didn't recognize it. Curiosity. What children could she possibly be referring to after all this time? What news could be worth tracking him for weeks? What questions could possibly matter after a decade of solitude? Edgar slept fitfully. That night, his dreams filled not with the usual horrors, but with Elizabeth's voice saying words he couldn't quite hear. When dawn broke, he rose and stepped onto his porch, unsurprised to find Elizabeth still there, a small fire burning low before her, her hands cradling a tin cup. She looked up as his door opened, her expression neither expectant nor demanding. Simply present. Edgar took a deep breath, then gestured toward his door, the first invitation he had extended to anyone in 10 years of solitude. Elizabeth Hargrove stepped into Edgar's kitchen with the careful movements of a woman, accustomed to entering spaces where she might not be welcome. Her eyes swept the small room, the neat table with its single chair, the fireplace with a pot of coffee already warming, the shelf of preserved vegetables along the back wall. Everything orderly, minimal, practical. Nothing unnecessary, nothing frivolous, a survivor's home. Edgar gestured to the chair, then busied himself at the hearth, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. The familiar task gave his hands something to do while his mind raced. In 10 years, no one had crossed his threshold. Now this stranger sat at his table, her presence filling the kitchen in a way that made it feel both smaller and less empty. Elizabeth set her satchel and folder on the table. She watched as he prepared coffee, her movements efficient and precise. "I work for the Riverside Children's Aid Society in St. Louis," she said finally, breaking the silence. "We place orphaned children with suitable families throughout the Midwest." She spoke simply, without embellishment, stating facts rather than making conversation. Edgar appreciated the directness. He placed a steaming mug before her, then stood back, leaning against the wall rather than sitting. Even this small interaction felt overwhelming after so much solitude. Elizabeth took a sip, then looked up at him. 3 weeks ago, a train derailed 40 miles east of here. Among the survivors were 12 children being transported to various placements in the Western Territories. Edgar's hands tightened around his own mug, the world outside his quiet existence suddenly reaching in, unwelcome and intrusive. The children are currently housed in the Springfield Depot warehouse. Conditions are poor, resources stretched thin, Elizabeth continued. "I've been searching for alternative accommodations, while arrangements can be made for their continued journey." Edgar closed his eyes briefly. He could see where this was leading, and something like panic washed through him. He set his cup down with shaking hands and moved to the door, opening it in a clear invitation for her to leave. Elizabeth remained seated. "Mr. Mercer, I understand your reluctance. I know about your family." Edgar froze, hands still on the doorknob. "The town doctor told me when I inquired about local families who might help. He also mentioned that you have the largest property in the area, with a barn that could be converted to temporary housing." Her voice softened slightly. "These children have nowhere else to go. The nearest suitable facility is overflowing, and winter is coming." Edgar stared at her, disbelief washing over him. After 10 years of isolation, this woman expected him to open his home to children, to hear young voices again in the spaces where his own children's laughter had been silenced. It was unthinkable. He shook his head sharply, definitively. Elizabeth didn't press. She simply nodded, finished her coffee, and stood. "I understand, Mr. Mercer. I won't impose further." She gathered her belongings and moved to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "The oldest is Thomas, 14. He's been keeping the others together since the accident, refusing to let them be separated. The youngest is Sarah, barely 5. Her eyes met his. Sometimes the thing we fear most is exactly what might save us." Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Edgar stood motionless in the center of his kitchen, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. He moved to the window, watching as Elizabeth made her way toward the road that led back to town. She walked with purpose but without hurry, her back straight, her steps measured. He pressed his palm against the glass, a sudden irrational fear gripping him that once she disappeared from sight, the fragile connection to the outside world would vanish too. But she didn't go far, just to the bend where a rented buggy waited, close enough that he could still see her preparing to depart. Something shifted in Edgar's chest, a loosening of the knot pulled tight 10 years ago. He didn't know if it was relief or terror. The following day brought no clarity. Edgar went about his routines, feeding his chickens, mending a loose board on the porch, harvesting the last of the summer tomatoes, but his thoughts circled continuously to Elizabeth's words. 12 children, homeless, winter approaching. He found himself pausing at windows, scanning the road that led to town, startling at shadows, flinching at the cry of birds overhead. The solitude he had carefully maintained now felt suffocating, his silent house accusing rather than comforting. Midday, he spotted a rider approaching from Town Sheriff Davis on his dappled mare. Edgar watched from behind his curtain as the lawman slowed near his gate, then dismounted and tied his horse. The visit wasn't entirely unexpected. News traveled fast in a place like Pinewood Crossing, and a city woman asking about the town recluse would certainly qualify as news. Edgar met him at the door before he could knock, his expression carefully neutral. "Mercer," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His weathered face gave little away, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. "Thought I'd check on you. Heard you had a visitor yesterday." Edgar nodded once, confirming what the lawman already knew. "That woman from St. Louis still bothering you?" Edgar shook his head firmly. "You sure about that?" "Not like you to have company." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly, skeptical. "Especially women from the city asking about putting orphans in your barn." Edgar's jaw tightened at the implication. He pointed toward town, then made a dismissive gesture. "Clear enough. Not your business." Sheriff Davis sighed. "Look, Mercer, I respect your privacy. God knows you've earned your peace after what happened to your family. But this town looks after its own. If that woman is causing you trouble—" Edgar cut him off with a sharp gesture, his expression hardening. He pointed to himself, then to his property, then made a circular motion with his finger. "My choice, my business. End of discussion." The sheriff studied his face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Have it your way. But I'll be keeping an eye out. Town's got enough trouble without adding a pack of orphans to the mix." As he turned to leave, Edgar impulsively caught his sleeve. When the sheriff looked back, surprised, Edgar pantomimed writing. "You need something written down?" he asked. Edgar nodded, then pointed down the road that led to Springfield, raised his eyebrows in question. "You asking if she went back to Springfield?" The sheriff was accustomed to interpreting Edgar's gestures after 10 years of wordless exchanges. Edgar nodded again, more urgently. "Matter of fact, she's still in town. Took a room at Mrs. Henley's boarding house. Said she'd be staying a few days, looking for other options in the county." The sheriff studied Edgar's face. "That means something to you?" Edgar schooled his expression into careful blankness, but his pulse quickened. She hadn't given up. Somehow that knowledge both unsettled and intrigued him. He shook his head slightly, then stepped back, signaling the conversation was over. The sheriff watched him a moment longer, clearly unsatisfied, then touched his hat again and departed. Edgar watched until the lawman disappeared around the bend, then sagged against the doorframe. The world was closing in, his carefully constructed sanctuary crumbling at its edges. For the first time in 10 years, he truly regretted his silence. Words had power to explain, to defend, to question. Without them, he was vulnerable in ways he couldn't afford to be. He spent the afternoon in restless activity, cleaning his already immaculate kitchen, organizing preserves that needed no organizing, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling into memories he'd worked a decade to contain. As dusk approached, he found himself drawn to the small trunk in his bedroom, the one he hadn't opened in years. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in faded quilting, lay the small shoes, 4 pairs in descending sizes. Beside them, a woman's hairbrush with strands still caught in the bristles, a child's wooden top, a handmade doll with button eyes. Edgar lifted each item carefully, memories washing over him. Josephine brushing her hair by lamplight. Little Mary learning to spin the top on the kitchen floor. Samuel proudly wearing his first real boots. Baby James taking his first wobbly steps in leather moccasins. He had preserved these mementos like insects in amber, keeping them unchanged while he himself had withered. The realization struck him with unexpected force. What would Josephine think of the man he had become? What would his children recognize in this silent, isolated shadow of their father? The question haunted him through the evening and into the night. He sat on his porch, rocking slowly, watching stars appear in the velvet sky. The air grew cooler, autumn asserting itself against the last resistance of summer. A movement at the edge of his property caught his attention. A figure approached. In the gathering darkness, Elizabeth, carrying a lantern. Edgar didn't rise, didn't retreat inside. He watched as she reached his gate, then stopped, respecting the boundary. "Good evening, Mr. Mercer," she called softly. "I hope I'm not intruding." Edgar made no response, but he didn't turn away either. "I wanted to let you know I'll be taking the children to see potential housing options tomorrow. The railroad has offered an abandoned section house about 10 miles south." She paused. "It's not ideal, far from town, in poor repair, but it might serve until spring." Edgar remained motionless, though his heart beat faster at the mention of the children. "I also thought you might like to know a little about them," Elizabeth continued, setting her lantern on a fence post. "Thomas, the oldest, has been caring for his younger brother Michael since their parents died in a mining accident 2 years ago. He's remarkably responsible for a boy his age." Edgar's hands tightened on the arms of his rocking chair. He didn't want to hear this, didn't want these unknown children to become real to him. And yet, he found himself unable to rise and go inside. "Emma and Sarah are sisters. Their mother was traveling west to teach at a reservation school when the derailment happened. Emma's 8, protective of 5-year-old Sarah, who barely speaks, not unlike yourself, Mr. Mercer." A pang went through Edgar at this, a child who didn't speak. He knew too well the weight of such silence. The Keller triplets, George, Henry, and Harriet, lost their father in the war and their mother to consumption last winter. They're 7, inseparable, full of mischief but good-hearted. Elizabeth's voice carried clearly in the night air, painting pictures Edgar couldn't help but see in his mind's eye. Daniel and Ruth Cooper, 10 and 9, were being sent to live with an uncle they've never met in Oregon. He's a blacksmith. Daniel wants to follow in his footsteps. Ruth collects feathers, says quite a remarkable assortment saved from the journey. Edgar closed his eyes, willing the images away, but they persisted. Samuel Jackson is 12, serious and bookish. Wants to be a doctor someday. Rebecca Taylor is 11, has a beautiful singing voice, though she's shy about using it except to soothe the younger ones when they're frightened. Edgar flinched at the name Samuel, his own son's name, then again at the mention of singing. Josephine had sung constantly, filling their home with melody. And finally, William Carter, 6 years old, full of questions about everything, particularly fascinated by farming. His parents had a small place in Kansas before the drought took it and them. Elizabeth fell silent, letting her words settle in the space between them. Edgar remained still, his emotions too tangled to sort through. After a moment, she retrieved her lantern. "I don't mean to pressure you, Mr. Mercer. I simply thought you should know them as people, not just as a problem to be solved. Whatever you decide, I respect your choice." She turned to go, then paused. "They'll be passing by tomorrow around noon, if you'd care to see them. No obligation, of course." She walked away, the light of her lantern bobbing like a firefly in the darkness, until it disappeared down the road toward town. Edgar sat long into the night, her words echoing in his mind. 12 children, each with their own story, their own loss. Children who, like him, had seen the world take everything and leave them adrift. The parallel wasn't lost on him, nor was the irony. He who had lost his children, they who had lost their parents, all incomplete pieces that didn't seem to fit anywhere. When he finally went inside, he didn't sleep. Instead, he found himself moving through the house, seeing it through new eyes. The barn, as Elizabeth had noted, was substantial, originally built to house livestock for a much larger operation than his subsistence farming. With work, it could indeed shelter people. The house itself had 3 bedrooms besides his own, unused for a decade, doors closed on empty spaces. By dawn, Edgar had come no closer to a decision. He went about his morning chores mechanically, his mind elsewhere. As the sun climbed higher, he found himself repeatedly checking the road, though whether hoping to see the children or dreading it, he couldn't say. Just before noon, he heard them, a wagon approaching, the sound of young voices carried on the breeze. Edgar retreated to his porch, heart hammering in his chest. He could turn away, go inside, close the door on this intrusion from the world. It would be easier, safer. Instead, he found himself rooted in place as the wagon came into view. Elizabeth drove, a boy who must be Thomas beside her on the seat. In the back, arranged on straw and blankets, were the others 11 children. Of various ages, their faces curious as they took in the farm. Edgar gripped the porch railing, fighting the urge to flee. As the wagon slowed near his gate, he could see them more clearly. The triplets, identical but for the ribbons in Harriet's hair. A tiny girl who must be Sarah, clutching her older sister's hand. A solemn boy with a book, Samuel, the aspiring doctor. And all of them, every single one, bearing the unmistakable look of children who had seen too much, too soon. Elizabeth didn't stop, respecting his boundaries. She nodded in greeting but kept the wagon moving slowly past his property. Some of the children waved tentatively. The youngest boy, William, who was fascinated by farming, stood up to get a better look at Edgar's fields, only to be gently pulled back down by Thomas. As they passed from view, Edgar released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Something had shifted inside him, seeing those children. They weren't abstract concepts anymore, but flesh and blood, their faces, now imprinted in his mind alongside those of his own lost family. He spent the afternoon in a daze, his thoughts churning. Around sunset, he found himself walking the perimeter of his barn, assessing it with new eyes. The structure was sound, though it would need cleaning, patching in places. The loft could be converted to sleeping quarters with relative ease. The main floor would need more work, a cooking area, tables, places to wash. He had no illusions about his capacity to care for children. He could barely care for himself most days. But shelter, that he could provide. A temporary refuge until spring, as Elizabeth had said. Surely he could manage that much without breaking apart. As darkness fell, Edgar made his decision. Not with peace or certainty, but with a grim determination that felt like the first purposeful choice he had made in a decade. He lit his lantern and began walking toward town, following the same road the wagon had taken hours earlier. Pinewood Crossing was quiet as he approached, most businesses closed for the night. Lights spilled from the Silver Dollar Saloon, and a few homes still showed lamps in windows. Mrs. Henley's boarding house sat at the far end of the main street, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and gabled windows. Edgar paused at the picket fence that surrounded the property, doubt suddenly assailing him. What was he doing? What madness had possessed him to think he could offer anything to these children? He was a broken man, a ghost drifting through the remains of his own life. As he stood there, frozen with indecision, the front door opened. Elizabeth stepped out onto the porch, as if somehow sensing his presence. She spotted him immediately, standing in the pool of light cast by the street lamp. "Mr. Mercer," she said, neither surprised nor triumphant. "Would you like to come in?" Edgar shook his head, then gestured toward his farm and raised his eyebrows in question. Elizabeth descended the porch steps and approached the fence. "Are you offering your property for the children?" He nodded once, sharply. Her expression softened with what might have been relief. "That's very generous. Are you certain?" Edgar wasn't certain of anything, except that he couldn't bear the thought of those children in an abandoned section house 10 miles from anywhere, with winter coming on. He nodded again, more firmly this time. "Thank you," Elizabeth said simply. "Truly, this will make an enormous difference for them." She studied his face in the lamplight. "Would you like to meet them properly? They're still awake, getting ready for bed." Panic flared in Edgar's chest. He took a step back, shaking his head. Not yet, maybe not ever. Offering his property was one thing. Facing 12 children, with their questions and needs and inevitable reminders of all he had lost. That was something else entirely. Elizabeth seemed to understand. Of course, there's no rush. Perhaps once they're settled. She glanced back at the boarding house. We could bring them out tomorrow, start setting up the barn. Would that be acceptable? Edgar nodded, relieved at the reprieve. Is there anything you need us to bring? Any preparations you'd like made first? Edgar considered this, then mimed sweeping, scrubbing. We'll bring cleaning supplies, of course. And bedding, what food we have. She hesitated. The children don't have much. Most of their belongings were lost in the derailment. But they're good workers, even the younger ones. They'll help with whatever needs doing. Edgar nodded again, then turned to go, his capacity for interaction exhausted. Mr. Mercer, Elizabeth called softly after him. He paused without turning. This is a good thing you're doing. I believe it will bring healing, not just for them but perhaps for you as well. Edgar couldn't bring himself to acknowledge this. Healing wasn't what he sought. He had long since abandoned that hope. This was atonement, perhaps, or simple human decency. Or maybe just the action of a man too tired of his own company to turn away even the most difficult alternative. He walked back to his farm under a sky brilliant with stars, his decision sitting uneasily within him. Tomorrow would bring noise, confusion, the invasion of his carefully maintained solitude. Children's voices would echo where he had cultivated. Silence. Small feet would trace paths across his land. Questions would hang in the air, requiring answers he wasn't sure he could give. Yet alongside the dread ran a thin current of something he barely recognized: anticipation, perhaps, or purpose. For 10 years he had existed in a holding pattern, neither living nor dying, just enduring each day until the next arrived. Now, for better or worse, that pattern was broken. Edgar spent the night preparing as best he could. He swept the barn floor, cleared out old hay and debris, mended what he could by lamplight. In the loft, he arranged clean straw for bedding, though it was a poor substitute for proper mattresses. He found old blankets in a trunk, shook them out, and folded them in neat piles. By dawn, exhaustion pulled at him, but the barn looked more habitable than it had in years. He returned to the house, washed, and changed his clothes. Then he sat on his porch to wait, watching the road with a mixture of dread and resignation. They arrived mid-morning, Elizabeth driving the same wagon, now loaded with supplies. Thomas walked alongside, leading a second wagon borrowed from a sympathetic townsman. The other children followed on foot, carrying what little they owned in small bundles or flour sack pocketbooks. Edgar stood as they approached his gate, his hands clenched at his sides to hide their trembling. Elizabeth stopped the wagon and jumped down, coming to stand before him with a respectful distance between them. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer. We're here as arranged." She gestured to the children, who had clustered together, watching him with wary curiosity. "Children, this is Mr. Edgar Mercer. He has kindly offered his barn as our shelter until more permanent arrangements can be made." The oldest boy, Thomas, stepped forward. He was tall for 14, with serious eyes and shoulders already set with responsibility beyond his years. "Thank you, sir. We're grateful for your hospitality and won't be any trouble." Edgar nodded, uncomfortable with the boy's formality. These children had been taught manners somewhere, despite their hard circumstances. Elizabeth turned to the group. "Let's get everything unloaded and set up before midday. Thomas, you and Michael take the heavier items. Emma, help Sarah and William. Everyone else, grab what you can carry." The children moved with practiced efficiency, forming a line between the wagons and the barn. Edgar watched, struck by their orderliness, the way the older ones automatically assisted the younger without being asked. These were children who had learned to work together, to rely on each other in the absence of adult support. Elizabeth approached him again. "I've brought what supplies I could gather, some bedding, cooking utensils, basic foodstuffs." The town has been reasonably generous, though there are some who disapprove. She glanced toward the barn. May I see what we have to work with? Edgar led her to the barn, staying well ahead of the children, who gave him a wide berth as they carried their bundles. Inside, Elizabeth surveyed his night's work with approval. You've done a great deal already. The loft will make an excellent sleeping area. She pointed to a corner. We could set up a cooking space there, with proper ventilation, of course. She walked the perimeter, making mental notes. Water is the biggest concern. Is your well reliable? Edgar nodded. His well had never run dry, even in the harshest summers. Excellent. We'll need to establish a bathing schedule, laundry facilities. She turned to him. I don't expect you to provide for them beyond shelter, Mr. Mercer. The Aid Society will. Send a stipend for food and necessities, and I'll remain to supervise until a more permanent solution is found. This was a relief to Edgar, who had been wondering about the practical aspects of hosting 12 children. He had little money saved, certainly not enough to feed so many growing bodies through a winter. The children had begun bringing in their bundles, arranging them in the loft under Thomas's direction. They worked quietly, with occasional whispers but no complaints, casting curious glances at Edgar when they thought he wasn't looking. The youngest girl, Sarah, separated from her sister and wandered toward Edgar, clutching a threadbare rag doll. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with solemn eyes. Edgar froze, uncertain how to respond to this tiny person. Sarah didn't speak, didn't approach further, just regarded him with a gaze too old for her 5 years. After a moment, she held out her doll as if offering to share its comfort with him. A lump formed in Edgar's throat. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to her level, and gently touched the doll's worn fabric head. Sarah's face remained serious, but something in her eyes lightened. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself, then turned and ran back to her sister. Edgar straightened, his heart pounding. That small interaction, wordless though it had been, was more intimate human contact than he had permitted himself in a decade. It left him shaken, unsure whether to retreat to the safety of his house or remain to see what other unexpected moments this day might bring. Elizabeth had been watching the exchange, her expression thoughtful. Sarah doesn't speak, she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Not since the accident. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong. The trauma affected her differently than the others. Edgar nodded. He understood all too well how grief could steal words, how some pains went too deep for language to touch. The children will establish their own space here, Elizabeth continued. Your daily routine need not be disrupted. They understand boundaries and will respect your privacy. She hesitated. However, I do hope you might consider taking meals with us occasionally. It would help them feel less like unwanted intruders. Edgar's instinct was to refuse immediately. The thought of sitting at a table with 12 children, with their questions and energy and needs, was overwhelming. Yet he found himself unable to deny this simple request outright. Instead, he gave a non-committal gesture that could be interpreted as either agreement or reluctance. Elizabeth accepted this with a nod. We'll get settled today, establish routines. Tomorrow, the children will attend school in town. I've already spoken with Miss Cambridge. Thomas and Samuel will help with heavier farm work if you're amenable. The others are capable of various chores appropriate to their ages. As she spoke, the children continued arranging the barn, transforming it with surprising speed from an empty space to something resembling a communal living area. The triplets were sweeping with brooms too tall for them, giggling as they worked. Daniel and Ruth were arranging stones for a cooking hearth, under Thomas's guidance. William was examining every corner of the barn with intense curiosity, touching tools and asking Michael questions that the older boy answered with patient simplicity. It struck Edgar that despite everything these children had endured, loss, displacement, uncertainty, They approached this new situation with resilience, even flashes of joy. They had not surrendered to grief as he had. They had not allowed tragedy to define their entire existence. They adapted, they continued, they found moments of lightness even in shadow. For the first time in 10 years, Edgar Mercer felt shame. Not the dull self-loathing that had become his constant companion, but a sharper, clearer recognition of how thoroughly he had surrendered to his pain, how completely he had removed himself from life. The revelation was uncomfortable, unwelcome. He turned abruptly and strode back to his house, closing the door firmly behind him. Through his window, he could see the continued activity in the barn, could hear the muffled sounds of children's voices carried on the autumn breeze. What had he done? In a moment of weakness, of misplaced guilt or sentimentality, he had invited chaos into his carefully ordered existence. Already he could feel the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. Already these children, with their resilience and their need, were challenging the narrative he had constructed to justify his isolation. Yet even as panic rose in him, another feeling surfaced alongside it, a faint stirring of something that felt dangerously like hope. Not for happiness or restoration, or any of the things he had long since abandoned as possibilities, but perhaps for purpose, for a life that consisted of more than simply waiting to die. The week that followed challenged Edgar in ways he hadn't anticipated. The physical presence of the children was expected, the sound of their movements, their voices. Carrying across the yard, the extra draw on as well. What he hadn't prepared for was their impact on his inner landscape, the way they disrupted the careful emotional barricade he had maintained for a decade. Each child, he discovered, presented a unique intrusion into his solitude. Thomas, responsible, beyond his years, approached Edgar each morning with respectful questions about farm work that needed doing. His calm competence made outright rejection impossible, and Edgar found himself reluctantly scrawling tasks on a slate the boy carried. Samuel, the aspiring doctor, watched Edgar with analytical curiosity, as if he were a specimen to be studied. "Mrs. Hargrove says you can talk but choose not to," he said matter-of-factly on the third day, having cornered Edgar by the chicken coop. "I read about selective mutism in a medical journal. It's often associated with severe trauma." Edgar had walked away without acknowledging him, but the boy's words lingered, his condition named and categorized in a way that made it seem less like a choice and more like an affliction. The triplets, George, Henry, and Harriet, approached. His isolation as a challenge. They left small gifts on his porch, a perfectly round stone, a drawing of his house, wildflowers arranged in a tin can, each offering a tiny bridge he couldn't bring himself to cross, but couldn't quite ignore either. Ruth with her feather collection asked permission, through pantomime gestures, to collect from his chicken yard. When he nodded his assent, her face had brightened with such disproportionate gratitude that he'd had to turn away, uncomfortable with the ease of pleasing her. William, the youngest boy, followed Edgar at a distance whenever possible, watching his every movement with undisguised fascination. "Mr. Mercer knows farming better than anybody," he informed Elizabeth loudly one evening as Edgar passed the barn on his way to check his fence line. "I'm learning all his tricks just by watching." Only little Sarah, who shared his silence, seemed to truly understand his need for space. When the others crowded him, she would often appear at their side, tugging at a sleeve or hand until they moved away. Her solemn eyes held a wisdom beyond her years, a recognition of boundaries born of her own protective withdrawal. Edgar maintained his distance as best he could, taking meals alone in his house, limiting his interaction to necessary exchanges about the property. But in 1,000 small ways, the children infiltrated his consciousness, forcing him to see and hear and feel in ways he had forgotten were possible. On the 5th day, a cold rain kept the children confined to the barn. By afternoon, the sound of their indoor games and chatter had developed a frantic edge that spoke of too many bodies in too small a space. Edgar found himself pacing his kitchen, their restless energy somehow communicating itself to him across the yard. Before he had fully formed the intention, he found himself pulling on his rain slicker and heading to the tool shed. Inside, pushed to the back corner beneath a tarp, lay the wooden toys he had carved during those first terrible months after losing his family. He had created them in a fever of grief and denial, making Christmas presents for children who would never receive them. For 10 years they had remained hidden, too painful to look at, impossible to discard. Now he gathered them, a set of carved farm animals, a small wheeled cart, tops and spinning buttons, a collection of dolls with jointed limbs that could be posed in different positions. Tucked beneath them all was the wooden board with the fox and geese game he had made for his oldest son's 8th birthday, never celebrated. Edgar carried the toys to the barn, hesitating at the door, suddenly unsure. Through the gaps in the planking, he could see the children sprawled around the space, the older ones attempting to engage the younger in quiet activities, everyone showing signs of confinement fatigue. He pushed the door open with his foot. The children fell silent immediately, all eyes turning to him with varying degrees of surprise. Without meeting their gazes, Edgar set the box of toys on the ground just inside the door, then turned and walked back to his house without looking back. From his kitchen window, he watched as Thomas discovered the box, calling the others over. Even at that distance, Edgar could see their expressions transform delight, wonder, excitement rippling through the group as they explored his offerings. The triplets immediately began setting up the farm animals, creating an elaborate scenario. William reverently examined the cart, testing its wheels on the barn floor. Ruth and Emma arranged the dolls, bending their limbs into different positions. And Sarah, smallest of them all, approached the barn door with the fox and geese board clutched to her chest. For a long moment, she stood there, looking toward his house, her expression unreadable. Then she set the game down carefully just outside the barn, turned, and went back inside. An invitation, or perhaps a recognition. Either way, Edgar found himself deeply shaken by the simple gesture. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat in his rocking chair by the fire, trying to understand the unfamiliar emotions churning within him. Grief was an old companion, familiar in its contours. Guilt, too, he recognized, the survivor's burden he had carried since the fever took his family and left him inexplicably untouched. But this new feeling, this uncomfortable stirring beneath his ribs, was harder to name. It felt like hunger, but not for food. A craving for something he had denied himself for so long he had almost forgotten its existence. Connection, perhaps. Or purpose. Or simply the acknowledgement that despite everything, he remained among the living. Dawn found him still in the chair, stiff and unrested, but somehow more resolved. He couldn't undo the damage of 10 years in a day, couldn't transform himself into the kind of man who welcomed 12 orphans with open arms. But perhaps he could take one small step toward being something more than a ghost in his own life. When Thomas knocked on his door that morning for the daily work assignments, Edgar surprised them both by picking up his hat and stepping outside to demonstrate rather than simply writing instructions. The boy's momentary shock gave way to cautious pleasure as Edgar led him to the broken chicken coop door, showing him how the hinge needed to be reset. They worked side by side for an hour, their silence comfortable rather than strained. Thomas proved a quick study, anticipating Edgar's needs, handing him tools before he reached for them. When they finished, the boy stood back to admire their work. "My father was a carpenter before the mining," he said quietly. "He was teaching me before the accident." He ran a hand over the smoothly planed wood. "I've forgotten some of it." Edgar studied Thomas's face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the shadow of loss that darkened his eyes. He saw in this boy's expression a reflection of his own grief, but also something he had lost along the way: determination, resilience, the will to continue. Without conscious thought, Edgar placed a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a fleeting contact, but the first he had initiated with another human being in years. Thomas looked up, startled, then offered a small tentative smile. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," he said simply, though whether for the carpentry lesson or the moment of connection wasn't clear. Edgar nodded once, then turned back toward his house. Small steps, he reminded himself. Small steps were all he could manage. That evening, as the autumn air turned crisp with approaching frost, Edgar found himself drawn to the barn, despite his better judgment. The sound of Rebecca's singing drifted across the yard, a sweet, clear voice rendering a lullaby he recognized from his own childhood. The familiarity pulled at him, dragging memories to the surface that he had long suppressed. Josephine's singing, their children to sleep, Mary's attempts to join in with her small, uncertain voice. He stood outside the barn door, listening as the song concluded. Silence fell, then Elizabeth's voice. "That was beautiful, Rebecca. Sarah's already asleep." "She always falls asleep during the second verse," came the girl's soft reply. "It reminds her of before, I think." "Before is important," Elizabeth said. "We carry it with us always. But so is now, and what comes after. Do you really think there will be families for all of us?" This from one of the triplets, voice small with doubt. "I do," Elizabeth answered firmly. "The right families where you will be cherished as you deserve. Even all three of us together." That would be Harriet, Edgar guessed, always concerned about separation from her brothers, especially you three. "I promised, didn't I? What about Thomas and Michael?" Daniel's voice, protective of the older boys who looked after them all. "Nobody wants big boys." A pause, then Thomas's voice, deeper than the others. "It doesn't matter. Once I'm 16, I can work legally, get a place for Michael and me." "That's still 2 years away," Elizabeth reminded him gently. "And there's no need to carry the world on your shoulders alone. There are good people who understand the value of keeping families together." Edgar backed away from the door, unwilling to eavesdrop further. The conversation stirred uncomfortable questions. What would happen to these children when spring came? Would they truly find homes, or would they be separated, shipped to different corners of the country, their fragile community fractured beyond repair? And why did the thought disturb him so much? They were not his responsibility, not his concern, beyond the temporary shelter he had offered. Yet he found himself troubled by the uncertainty of their future in a way that surprised him. The following morning brought the first hard frost, silvering the grass and rimming the water trough with ice. Edgar rose early, building up the fire in his kitchen stove. Almost without thinking, he mixed a large batch of oatmeal, far more than he could eat alone, adding honey and dried apples from his cellar stores. When it was ready, he poured the steaming mixture into a large pot, covered it with a towel to keep in the heat, and carried it to the barn along with a stack of bowls and spoons. The children were just stirring, emerging from their blankets in the loft, when he pushed open the door. Their surprise at his appearance was evident, but hunger quickly overcame wariness as the smell of the warm breakfast filled the chilly air. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," Elizabeth said, taking the pot from him. "This is most kind." Edgar shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. He set down the bowls and turned to go, but little Sarah appeared at his side, tugging at his trousers. "When?" He looked down. She pointed to the fox and geese board, set up on a crate near the door, then raised her eyebrows in clear invitation. The other children watched, breath held collectively, as Edgar hesitated. He hadn't played the game since teaching his own son the rules years ago. The thought of sitting across from this solemn child, engaging even in this silent form of interaction, made his heart race with anxiety. But Sarah continued to look up at him, patient, undemanding, seemingly understanding his struggle. Something in her steady gaze grounded him, reminded him that she too lived in silence, that perhaps she offered not a challenge but a refuge, a way to connect that honored his limitations. Slowly, Edgar nodded. Sarah's face remained serious, but her eyes brightened. She climbed onto a crate on one side of the makeshift table, waiting as Edgar lowered himself onto another crate opposite her. The other children, sensing the fragility of the moment, resumed their morning activities with exaggerated nonchalance, though Edgar could feel their attention still on him. Sarah set up the board, placing the geese pieces and the single fox. With careful precision, she looked at Edgar questioningly, offering him first choice of sides. He pointed to the fox, a single piece against many, moving differently, isolated, but powerful. Sarah nodded as if his choice made perfect sense to her. They played in complete silence, the only sound the soft click of wooden pieces on the board. Sarah proved a thoughtful opponent, considering each move carefully before committing. When Edgar captured one of her geese, she accepted the loss with dignity. When she successfully blocked his fox, her satisfaction showed only in the slight upturn of her mouth. The game stretched over half an hour, by which time the other children had eaten and begun their morning chores. Elizabeth watched from a distance, her expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. In the end, Edgar's fox was cornered, unable to move in any direction. Sarah studied the board carefully, confirming her victory before looking up at him with serious eyes. She extended her small hand across the board, not in triumph but in acknowledgement, an equal offering respect to an equal. After a moment's hesitation, Edgar took her hand briefly in his rough one. The contact was fleeting but electric, a connection. Across the void of their shared silence, Sarah nodded once, then gathered the pieces, returning them to their starting positions, an invitation to play again another time. Edgar rose, his emotions too complex to untangle. He nodded to Elizabeth. On his way out, a small acknowledgement of what had transpired. As he crossed the yard back to his house, he was struck by how different the cold air felt against his skin, sharper somehow, more immediate, as if a layer of numbness had been stripped away. Later that day, Samuel found him in the orchard, collecting the last of the fallen apples before they could rot and attract vermin. "Mrs. Hargrove says you lost your family," the boy said without preamble, his directness both disconcerting and refreshingly free of pity. "To fever." Edgar stiffened but didn't walk away. After a moment, he nodded. "My mother was a nurse," Samuel continued, bending to pick up an apple Edgar had missed. "She taught me about fevers before she died. How to cool the body, when to give water, which herbal teas could help." Edgar's chest tightened at the casual mention of the very knowledge he had lacked when his family needed it most. He had tried everything he knew, called for the doctor who arrived too late, watched helplessly as the fever consumed his loved ones one by one. "I couldn't save her, though," Samuel added, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Or my father. The consumption took them both." Edgar looked at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. Samuel stood straight back despite the weight of his losses, his gaze direct, unflinching. Here was a child who had faced death, who carried grief that could have crushed him, yet still reached toward life with determined hands. "I'm going to be a doctor," Samuel stated, not as a dream but as a fact. No one should die of preventable illness. No one should watch their family suffer without having the knowledge to help them. The words struck Edgar like physical blows, exposing the rawness of his old guilt. If he had known more, done more, recognized the symptoms earlier, perhaps his family might have lived. The what-ifs had haunted him for a decade, feeding his isolation, justifying his surrender to grief. "Mrs. Hargrove says you're a good man who's been through too much," Samuel said, tossing the apple into Edgar's collection basket. "She says sometimes the hardest thing is to keep living when those we love are gone." Edgar's throat closed around. Emotions he couldn't express, even if he had been willing to break his silence. This boy, this child spoke of truths Edgar had been hiding from for years, and did so with a clarity that stripped away pretense. "Anyway," Samuel continued, practical beyond his years, I noticed your cough. It's the damp getting into your lungs. My mother would have made a tea with wild cherry bark and honey. I could show you where it grows, if you want." The casual offer of help, delivered without expectation or judgment, undid something in Edgar. He had been so long alone, so convinced of his isolation, that this simple human exchange, this recognition of need and offer of assistance felt revolutionary. He nodded, a small movement but significant. Samuel's face brightened. "Tomorrow morning, before school? The best bark is down by the creek." Another nod, more certain this time. "Good." The boy turned to go, then paused. "My mother also said that helping others is the best medicine for a grieving heart. Maybe that's why you let us stay here. Maybe you're already healing yourself and don't know it yet." Before Edgar could process this startling observation, Samuel was gone, hurrying back to the barn where his chores awaited. Edgar remained among the apple trees, the boy's words echoing in his mind. Healing, such a simple word for such a complex process. Had he even wanted to heal? Or had he, in some convoluted way, believed that recovery would be a betrayal of those he had lost? That his suffering was a form of loyalty, his isolation a monument to their absence? The questions followed him through the day, persistent as the children themselves. That evening, as darkness fell early with the approach of winter, Edgar found himself taking an unprecedented step walking to the barn at supper time, a basket of fresh bread and preserved fruit in his hands. The children's surprise at his appearance was evident, but Elizabeth recovered quickly. "Mr. Mercer, please join us. We're just about to eat." To everyone's astonishment, including his own, Edgar stayed. He didn't speak, didn't engage beyond passing food when asked, but he remained at the table, his first shared meal in a decade. The children, after initial wariness, continued their normal supper conversations around him. Thomas discussed the chicken coop repairs and his plans for reinforcing the barn door against winter drafts. Rebecca and Emma debated the best way to arrange the sleeping area to keep the younger children warmest. William reported excitedly on what he had learned in school that day, something about the state capitol and its founding, that he recounted with enthusiastic if inaccurate detail. The triplets argued good-naturedly about whose turn it was to help with dishes, while Daniel described a forge he had seen in town with longing evident in his voice. Ruth carefully wrapped bread crusts in her handkerchief, saving them to attract birds, Edgar realized, for her feather collection. Throughout the meal, Sarah sat beside Edgar, occasionally leaning against his arm when reaching for something, her casual physical contact both startling and oddly comforting. She ate methodically, her silence a counterpoint to the chatter around them, occasionally glancing up at him with what seemed like understanding. Edgar observed it all with growing awareness of what he had been missing in his self-imposed exile, not just human connection, but the particular energy of children, their resilience and curiosity, their capacity to find joy even amid hardship. These were not broken creatures, though each carried wounds. They were adapting, growing, reaching toward life rather than retreating from it. As the meal concluded and the children began clearing away dishes, Elizabeth moved to sit beside Edgar. "Thank you for joining us," she said quietly. "It means more than you know to them." Edgar glanced at her, questioning. "Children who have lost everything fear being forgotten, being unwanted," she explained. "Your presence tells them they matter, that they're worthy of attention." Edgar hadn't considered this perspective. He had been so focused on his own discomfort, his own reluctance, that he had failed to recognize what his withdrawal might mean to children already acquainted with abandonment. "The days are growing shorter," Elizabeth continued. "Winter will be here soon. The barn is adequate shelter, but I worry about the coldest nights, especially for the little ones." Edgar understood her unspoken question. The house had space empty. Bedrooms that had stood vacant for years, a kitchen large enough for many more than his solitary meals. Opening those spaces would mean a greater invasion of his privacy, a more complete disruption of his carefully constructed isolation. But as he watched the children working together to clean up after the meal, Thomas showing William how to dry dishes properly, Emma helping Sarah reach the shelf where cups were stored, he found the prospect less terrifying than it would have been weeks ago. These children had already breached his defenses in a dozen small ways. They had awakened sensations he had thought long dead: curiosity, concern, even moments of something approaching contentment. Perhaps the physical boundaries he maintained were becoming as hollow as the emotional ones they had already penetrated. Edgar stood, drawing Elizabeth's attention. He pointed toward his house, then held up 7 fingers, followed by a sweeping gesture toward the youngest children. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "You're offering to take the little ones into your house when the temperature drops below 7 degrees? At his nod, she continued, "That's extremely generous, Mr. Mercer. It would make a significant difference to their comfort and health." Edgar shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. It wasn't generosity driving his offer, but a growing recognition that his resistance was becoming more habit than necessity. And perhaps, though he was reluctant to examine this too closely, a sense that these children's presence had begun to thaw something long frozen within him. As he left the barn that evening, he heard Rebecca begin another song, a simple melody about stars guiding travelers home. The tune followed him across the yard, somehow making the darkness less complete, the night air less bitter. For the first time in years, Edgar Mercer lit the lamps in all his front windows before retiring, a beacon visible from the barn, a silent acknowledgement that those within its walls were not alone in the gathering winter, that someone kept watch with them against the coming cold. November arrived with bitter winds and the first dusting of snow. Edgar found himself watching the thermometer outside his kitchen window with new attention, checking it morning and evening. The mercury hadn't yet dipped below the 7-degree threshold he'd established, but winter's grip was tightening day by day. He spent hours preparing the house, airing out bedrooms that had been closed for a decade, sweeping away cobwebs, washing linens that carried the musty scent of disuse. Each task forced him to confront memories he had long avoided. Mary's treasured quilt, still folded at the foot of what had been her bed. Samuel's collection of arrowheads arranged on a shelf. The cradle in the corner of the smallest bedroom, empty and waiting for a child who never lived to see his first birthday. The pain was sharp, but somehow cleaner than the dull ache he had carried for so long. There was purpose in his actions now, practical concerns that demanded attention beyond his grief. The house needed to be warm, safe, welcoming to children who had already endured too much hardship. Edgar raised a hand in farewell, watching as the boy trudged back through the cold to the barn. The exchange left him thoughtful, aware of currents running beneath the surface of their arrangement, attachments forming, future concerns mounting. Inside, the house had grown quiet. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, writing in a leather-bound journal by lamplight. She looked up as Edgar entered, offering a tired smile. "They're all asleep finally." It took some doing new surroundings. Excitement. Concern about being separated from the others in the barn. She closed her journal. "I can't thank you enough for this, Mr. Mercer. The difference a warm house makes to children in winter, it's immeasurable." Edgar made a dismissive gesture. The house had stood largely empty for years. Using it this way was simple practicality. "Still," Elizabeth persisted, "your generosity goes beyond what most would offer. Many in town said you wouldn't last a week with children disrupting your solitude, yet here we are." She studied him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "They're changing you, aren't they? The children?" The question was direct, uncomfortable in its accuracy. Edgar turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in her words. "It's nothing to be ashamed of," Elizabeth said softly. "Being affected by them. Children have a way of bypassing our defenses, of reminding us what it means to be human, even when we've forgotten. Edgar remained silent, though the words resonated with his own experience of the past weeks. The children had indeed bypassed. His carefully constructed barriers had awakened feelings he had thought permanently deadened by grief. I've been corresponding with aid societies in St. Louis and Chicago, Elizabeth continued, changing the subject slightly. There are possibilities for placements in the spring. A few families looking for older boys to help on farms. A childless couple interested in the triplets. A schoolteacher who might take Rebecca as a companion for her invalid daughter. Edgar turned back, something in her tone catching his attention. The difficulty is finding placements that don't separate siblings, Thomas and Michael, Emma and Sarah, and ensuring the homes are truly suitable, not just looking for cheap labor. She sighed. The system is imperfect at best, exploitative. At worst. I've seen too many children placed in situations where they're treated as servants rather than family members. The thought of any of these children, William with his endless questions, Ruth with her feather collection, solemn Sarah with her quiet understanding, being mistreated in a placement made. Edgar's chest tightened with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, protective anger. There's also the matter of Sarah, Elizabeth added, her voice lowering though the child was asleep upstairs. Her selective mutism makes placement challenging. Many families are reluctant to take a child with what they perceive as a defect. Edgar's hand clenched involuntarily. Sarah's silence was not a defect but a response to trauma, a shield she had created to protect herself in a world that had proven unsafe. That others might reject her for this adaptation seemed profoundly unjust. Elizabeth watched his reaction with interest. You understand her, don't you? Beyond the shared silence, you recognize something in her that others miss. Edgar couldn't deny it. From their first game of fox and geese, he had felt a connection to the small, solemn girl, a recognition that transcended words. They communicated in glances, in gestures, in the comfortable silence they shared. He had come to look forward. To her presence, to the way she would slip her hand into his when they walked to the barn to check on the others, to her serious consideration of each move in their board games. I believe she's healing being here, Elizabeth continued. She's more engaged, more present than when we first arrived. Yesterday, I heard her humming to herself as she arranged her doll on the bed, the first voluntary sound she's made in months. The news should have pleased Edgar, yet it also unsettled him. If Sarah was healing, finding her voice again, what did that mean for his own prolonged silence? Was it still a necessary protection, or had it become a habit, a hiding place he no longer truly needed? These questions followed him through the night and into the following days as winter settled fully over the farm. Snow fell, transforming the landscape into a wonderland that delighted the children. Edgar found himself watching from the window. As they built snow forts and fashioned crude sleds from barrel staves, their laughter carrying clearly in the crisp air. Thomas proved invaluable during this time, his practical knowledge of winter farm maintenance matching Edgar's own. Together they insulated the barn more thoroughly, ensuring the older children stayed warm during the bitter nights. They repaired equipment, split endless cords of firewood, and kept paths cleared between the buildings. The younger children adapted to life in the house with surprising ease. The triplets turned the front parlor into a schoolroom, practicing their letters and sums under Elizabeth's guidance. Ruth arranged her feather collection on the windowsill of her room, categorizing each specimen with careful labels. William followed Edgar everywhere, absorbing farming knowledge like a sponge, asking questions that required only nods or head shakes in response. And Sarah blossomed in ways both subtle and profound. She began drawing, filling pages with detailed pictures of the farm. The other children, and Edgar himself, always depicted as tall and strong, a central figure in her visual world. She created elaborate scenarios with the wooden animals, acting out stories of rescue and homecoming that revealed her inner hopes more clearly than words ever could. Christmas approached, bringing with it new challenges. Edgar had not celebrated the holiday since losing his family had. In fact, deliberately ignored it, staying in bed on Christmas Day as if it were any other. But the children's excitement was impossible to dismiss, their anticipation building with each handmade decoration that appeared in the house and barn. 2 weeks before Christmas, Edgar found himself doing something he had sworn never to do again, venturing into town for something other than absolute necessities. The general store was crowded with holiday shoppers, the atmosphere festive with pine boughs and red ribbons decorating the usually austere space. Mrs. Granger, the storekeeper's wife, nearly dropped a jar of molasses when Edgar approached the counter. "Mr. Mercer," she stammered, smoothing her apron nervously. "What a surprise!" Edgar placed a list on the counter, not his usual sparse accounting of basic supplies, but a more extensive inventory. Fabric for doll clothes, wooden buttons, small carpentry tools suitable for a boy's hands, colored pencils, a book of bird illustrations, hard candy, warm stockings in various sizes. Mrs. Granger's eyes widened as she read. "Well now," she said, recovering her composure. "Looks like those orphans are in for a proper Christmas after all." Edgar met her gaze steadily, challenging her to make more of it than simple human decency. The woman had the grace to look embarrassed. "I'll gather these items right away, Mr. Mercer. And may I say, it's good to see you in town again. Been too long since you've been properly among folks." Edgar didn't acknowledge this observation, but neither did he retreat as he might have months earlier. Instead, he browsed the store while waiting, examining things he had ignored for years: new tools, books, household goods that might improve life for 13 people, sharing a farm designed for one family. Sheriff Davis entered, stamping snow from his boots. He nodded to Edgar, surprise evident in his expression. "Mercer, didn't expect to see you in town." Edgar returned the nod, bracing for unwelcome questions about his unusual house guests. Instead, the lawman said, "That boy Thomas has a good head on his shoulders. Caught him helping old Mrs. Jenkins clear her walkway yesterday. Wouldn't take a penny for it. Said you'd taught him that neighbors help neighbors without expectation." Edgar blinked, startled by this information. He had never explicitly instructed Thomas in matters of neighborliness, had in fact been a poor example of it himself for years. That the boy would attribute such a lesson to him was both unearned and humbling. "Whole town's talking about what you're doing for those children," the sheriff continued, lowering his voice. Most never thought to see the day Edgar Mercer would open his home to anyone, let alone a pack of orphans with nowhere else to go. There was respect in the man's tone, free from the condescension or pity Edgar had grown accustomed to hearing. He shifted uncomfortably, unused to approval from others after so long living at the margins of the community. "Just wanted you to know," the sheriff concluded. "If you need anything, extra supplies, help with repairs, whatever folks are willing. Might have taken us all too long to reach out after what happened to your family, but we're reaching now." The offer was unexpected, stirring complicated emotions. Edgar had isolated himself, true, but the town had allowed that isolation, had perhaps even encouraged it out of discomfort with his grief. This tentative extension of community support represented a shift in their relationship as significant as the changes in his own outlook. He managed a nod of acknowledgement before Mrs. Granger returned with his purchases, carefully wrapped and boxed. Edgar paid without meeting her eyes, eager now to return to the farm, to the strange new life he was building there. The days before Christmas passed in a flurry of secret preparations. Late at night, after the children were asleep, Edgar worked in his shed, crafting simple gifts, a set of nesting boxes for Ruth's feathers, a small workbench sized for Thomas, a pictorial alphabet block set for Sarah that might encourage her towards speech. Elizabeth, too, was busy with clandestine projects, knitting scarves and mittens, fashioning rag dolls with button eyes, baking spice cookies that filled the house with fragrant warmth. The older children whispered together in corners, giggling when adults approached, clearly orchestrating surprises of their own. Christmas Eve arrived with another heavy snowfall. Edgar spent the afternoon helping Thomas and Samuel bring the older children from the barn to the house, where they would all spend the holiday together. The boys had crafted simple gifts for the younger ones: wooden tops, a jumping jack toy, a set of dominoes, and needed a place to hide them until morning. By evening, the house was full to bursting. 13 children and 2 adults gathered, in spaces designed for a family half that size. Yet instead of feeling crowded or chaotic, the rooms seemed to expand to accommodate their needs, as if the house itself welcomed the return of life within its walls. They gathered in the front parlor after supper, arranged around the fireplace where flames danced merrily against the backdrop of swirling snow outside the windows. Elizabeth read the Christmas story from a worn Bible, her voice gentle in the lamplight. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, the youngest fighting sleep, the oldest watching the younger ones with indulgent smiles. When she finished reading, Rebecca began to sing "Silent Night," her clear voice rising pure and sweet in the warm air. One by one, the other children joined in, even Thomas, whose adolescent voice cracked on the higher notes, bringing giggles from the triplets. Edgar sat slightly apart, watching this impromptu choir with a curious lightness in his chest. These children, marked by loss and displacement, sang of peace and heavenly rest with genuine joy. They had known hardship beyond their years, yet here they were, creating beauty in the midst of uncertainty, finding reason to celebrate despite all they had endured. As the song concluded, Sarah slipped from her place beside Elizabeth and crossed to where Edgar sat. Without hesitation, she climbed into his lap, an unprecedented intimacy that left him momentarily frozen. The small girl settled against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, completely trusting in her claim on him. The room fell silent, the other children watching with wide eyes, clearly expecting Edgar to withdraw from this uninvited contact. Even Elizabeth seemed to hold her breath, uncertain how he would respond to such a direct breach of his personal boundaries. For a long moment, Edgar remained still, overwhelmed by sensations he had denied himself for a decade the weight of. A child in his arms, the smell of soap and freshly washed hair, the delicate rhythm of breath against his chest. Sarah waited patiently, neither demanding response nor retreating from his rigidity. Then, with movements so natural they surprised even him, Edgar's arms came up to encircle the child, one hand gently cradling the back of her head. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to experience fully what he had for so long avoided: human connection, the simple comfort of holding and being held. When he opened his eyes again, he found the room watching him with expressions ranging from astonishment to quiet joy. Elizabeth wiped away a tear, while Thomas nodded as if confirming something he had long suspected. The younger children, taking their cue from Sarah's boldness, began migrating toward him, William leaning against his knee, Ruth settling at his feet, the triplets inching closer on the rug. Something shifted in Edgar's chest, a loosening, a release, as if a tight fist finally unclenched after years of rigid resistance. These children had done what time alone could not. They had breached the fortress of his grief, had reminded him that life continued, that connection remained possible even after devastating loss. And in that moment, surrounded by children who had also lost everything, yet continued to reach toward joy, Edgar Mercer made a decision that would alter the course of not just his life, but 13 others as well. "Stay," he said, his voice rough, from disuse but clear in the hushed room. "All of you. Stay here, with me." The words hung in the air, startling in their simplicity, revolutionary in their implications. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Thomas straightened from his casual lean against the doorframe, suddenly alert. The younger children looked confused, not fully comprehending the magnitude of what had just occurred. But Sarah, still cradled against Edgar's chest, simply reached up to touch his bearded cheek, a gesture of such tenderness, such acceptance, that it confirmed everything his broken declaration had attempted to express. "Home," she whispered, her voice thin and uncertain from lack of use, but unmistakable in the quiet room. "Home now." 2 words, a perfect echo of his own, creating between them a completion neither had found alone. Edgar tightened his arms around her, a silent promise. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white, covering old tracks, creating clean spaces for new journeys to begin. Inside, 13 children and a man who had expected to die alone discovered that family could be created. As well as born, that healing often arrived in the most unexpected forms, and that sometimes the greatest gifts were those we never knew to ask for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.